Introduction. The recent actions taken against FBI officials and prosecutors involved in the investigations related to the January 6th insurrection and classified document cases mark a dangerous turning point in U.S. governance. These firings and retaliatory measures appear to be politically motivated efforts to reshape the Justice Department into a tool of political power rather than an impartial enforcer of the law. The decision to purge law enforcement personnel who played a role in lawful investigations sets an alarming precedent. It signals that accountability is conditional on political affiliation, which is a direct attack on the independence of the justice system. If left unchecked, this could transform law enforcement into an arm of political persecution, where laws apply only to political enemies while allies operate with impunity. This situation raises urgent constitutional and legal concerns. Does firing law enforcement officials for investigating a president constitute an abuse of power? Does presidential immunity shield these actions from oversight or consequences? How can Congress and the judiciary prevent future abuses of this nature? Implications of this purge. The implications of these actions are severe and far-reaching. Erosion of independent law enforcement. If law enforcement officials fear political retribution, they will be reluctant to investigate crimes linked to powerful figures. The Justice Department will cease to function as an independent body and become a political enforcement arm. Legal and constitutional precedents. If the courts and Congress fail to intervene, this sets the stage for future leaders to manipulate justice without consequence. The use of law enforcement as a personal shield will make legal accountability impossible for those in power. National security risks. Firing experienced FBI personnel and prosecutors weakens the ability of law enforcement to combat domestic terrorism, organized crime, and foreign threats. Naming officials publicly puts them at risk of harassment and violence, making it harder to retain top talent in federal law enforcement. Why this is a problem? This situation represents a direct assault on the independence of U.S. law enforcement and is a grave threat to the rule of law in the United States. The purge of FBI agents and prosecutors who have been involved in lawful investigations, particularly those related to January 6th and classified document cases, is a clear attempt to dismantle accountability and reshape law enforcement into a political tool rather than an impartial force for justice. Firing law enforcement officials for doing their job sets a dangerous precedent. Threatening prosecutors and FBI agents discourages future investigations into corruption and criminal activity. Revealing the names of agents puts them at risk of harassment and violence. This fundamentally transforms the justice system into a tool that serves those in power rather than the law itself. If law enforcement is no longer independent, then laws will only apply to political enemies, not to those in power. This is authoritarianism. How this should be addressed. Congress must act to protect law enforcement agencies from politically motivated firings. Judicial oversight should be strengthened to prevent unlawful dismissals of federal investigators and prosecutors. Whistleblower protections must be extended to law enforcement officials targeted for political reasons. Transparency measures should be implemented to prevent the weaponization of government agencies. Legal and policy actions needed. Law Enforcement Independence Act prevents presidents from purging career FBI agents and prosecutors without due process. Federal law enforcement whistleblower protection expansion ensures legal safeguards for investigators targeted for political reasons. Judicial oversight of federal law enforcement dismissals requires an independent review panel before high-level law enforcement officials can be terminated. Ban on political retaliation against law enforcement criminalizes efforts to target prosecutors and FBI agents for investigating political figures. These policies ensure that law enforcement operates with integrity, regardless of political leadership. How it will be funded. Funding for oversight committees and judicial review panels should be allocated from existing Justice Department budgets. Independent watchdog groups and nonpartisan commissions should be given authority to investigate and report on political interference. Federal grants should support legal defense funds for law enforcement officials who are wrongfully terminated due to political retaliation. The cost of maintaining independent law enforcement is minimal compared to the damage of allowing political interference. The Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity states that a president has absolute immunity for core constitutional functions and presumptive immunity for other official acts. However, it does not grant immunity for private or unofficial acts. So, the key legal question is, does attempting to overturn an election or using law enforcement as a political weapon fall under official duties, or is it an abuse of power that is inherently unofficial? Why this should be considered unofficial? The president is bound by the Constitution to uphold democracy, not dismantle it. Engaging in a coup, election interference, or obstructing justice is not a constitutional duty. Using law enforcement for personal retribution is not part of the president's role. Criminal acts cannot be considered official acts simply because a president commits them. If that were the case, a president could order assassinations, steal money, or violate any law with no consequences. How this can be challenged legally? Congress should pass laws clarifying that criminal acts committed under the guise of presidential authority do not qualify as official acts. The courts must establish a precedent that separates legitimate executive actions from blatant abuse of power. If the Supreme Court rules that certain actions are immune, Congress could use impeachment and legislative measures to hold presidents accountable. No president should be above the law. The ruling creates a dangerous gray area that must be defined before it is exploited further. Final thought: protecting the rule of law. The attempt to purge law enforcement officials for investigating a political leader is a clear step toward authoritarianism. If law enforcement can be controlled and manipulated, then justice no longer exists, only political power does. Conclusion: the targeting and removal of law enforcement officials for fulfilling their duties undermines democracy and sets the U.S. on a path toward authoritarianism. If a president is allowed to remove investigators at will and retaliate against those who enforce the law, justice ceases to exist. Only political loyalty matters. This moment requires urgent action. Congress must pass legislation protecting law enforcement from political purges. Strengthen judicial oversight over federal dismissals. Clarify that presidential immunity does not cover acts that undermine democracy or obstruct justice. If left unaddressed, this will forever change the fabric of American democracy. No president should be above the law.